Hi, welcome to Module 4. We're going to talk to this module about categorical syllogisms. In Module 4, we talked about, or Module 3, I'm sorry, we talked about categorical logic. We learned about what A, E, I, O statements. And by using those squares of oppositions, we were able to learn that you can make certain direct inferences from those statements. So from an A statement, whether you're using, if a true and A statement, whether you're using an existential assumption or not, the modern square or the traditional square, you can infer that O statements are false, and a false O will infer a true A, and that kind of thing. But then if you make an existential assumption, you can infer a few things. Well, these are all basically just taking straight inferences out of those concepts, and it's taking, and you're using, the squares of opposition, things like that in order to do this, and Venn diagrams. And so what we're going to do is we're going to then say, well, that's great for direct inference from one statement, but what if you want to put more statements? What if you want to build upon that? Now, one of the things we didn't do in this module was we did not cover the last section of chapter 4, which is, I think, 4.7 in the textbook. In 4.7, what it does is it shows how you can translate pretty much any statement in English into a categorical statement. Once you transfer it into a categorical statement, then you can apply categorical logic, which is why this form of logic existed for couple thousand years before a more sophisticated form came along, which we'll talk about in the next module. But the case is that essentially for more than for a long time, we use this, and we could put statements together. And the way we would put them together is in what we call syllogism form. And syllogism is where you have two premises to one conclusion. You can't have three premises. You can't have one premise. It's always two premises, one conclusion. And in categorical logic, what we do is we realize that the conclusion is going to be a statement. It's always going to be formed an A, E, I, O statement. It's either going to be all S or P, no S or P, some S or P, or some S or not P. It's always going to be one of those four forms. Well, in order for you to take two categorical statements and make it work together, is you need for the subject of that conclusion to be in one of the premises, and you need the predicate of that conclusion to be in the other premise. And we usually always put it in the order of the one with the predicate is in the first one, the one with the subject is the second, called the minor term, and then you have the conclusion. But then in order for those two to connect, you have to have a subject or predicate, or subjects in both or predicates in both, that basically you need some term that isn't the subject of the conclusion or predicate or the predicate of the conclusion. And it has to be what we call the middle term. And it's the thing that sits in the middle of those two and links them. So it's in both the first premise and the second premise, which allows it to link together, allows us to take, if all dogs are canines and all canines are mammals, we're able to then connect the idea that all dogs are canines, canines are mammals, therefore all dogs are mammals. We're able to take that word canine as our middle term and connect it. Now, once we do this, we realize that there's more than one way to study this. There's three forms of logic. There are three forms of categorical logic, three ways we can prove whether or not these statements actually prove what we want them to prove. The first one and the second one we're going to learn this week, and then the third one we'll learn next week, and we'll take the test. The first one is basically just this idea that if we get them in the right order, we can say, okay, well, that's an A statement, the next one's an E statement, and the last one's an O statement. And we can then say, if we have an A, an E, an O, and then we can figure out, is the middle term the subject of both of our premises? Is the predicate of both our premises? Is it the subject of the first premise, the major term, and the predicate of the second one, or the subject, predicate? And there's four options there. And so what happens is you have the first premise can be four types, the second premise can be four types, the conclusion can be one of four types, and then you can have four different orders for where that middle term is. It can either be the subject of both premises, the predicate of both premises, subject and predicate of the first, and then the predicate of the second, or vice versa. And so what happens is once you do that, you can figure out that there's only 250 some ways for these sentences to be structured. You can take all language, put it into syllogisms, and in 250 different ways you can do it. Now, the other thing you can figure out is that there's only actually 24 ways that you can have a valid argument. So 9 of them will be conditionally valid, which means you have to make an existential assumption or know that the subject, the predicate, or the middle term exist, or the others are where you just know they always work whether or not the terms exist or not. Now, that is where we get the first type, and that's going to be a series where you basically just give the letter, figure out the form, figure out the mood, what we call the mood and the form, and then you figure it out. The next way is to actually make Venn diagrams, and basically before we had 2 circles, and you would put, shade the first area, shade the middle area, or shade the other area. If we add a 3rd circle with our middle term, we can then shade, and we can actually see if it proves it. Now, I will admit this is probably the least favorite way for everybody to do it. And then the final way, which we'll do next, the second week, is we will do what's called a rules method. And those 5 rules, there are 5 rules. And if you learn those 5 rules will let you determine whether or not every argument is valid or invalid. And the rules are basically, the middle term has to be distributed at least once. We learned about distribution at the beginning of the last module. If the subject or predicate of the conclusion is distributed, it must be distributed at least once in the premises. If you can't have 2 negative premises, and you can't have if you have a negative premise, you have to have a negative conclusion. You have a negative conclusion, you have to have a negative premise. And if the premises are universal, then the conclusion can't be particular, with the exception of if that's the only rule that gets broken, then you can make an existential assumption and actually it will work. If the things exist, it works. And so essentially that tells us the difference between Boolean and the modern, or Boolean and the Aristotelian versions of making an existential assumption. So we're going to learn those 3 methods. The nice thing about all 3 of these methods is no matter which one you use, they will all give you the exact same answer. So if you learn all 3 methods and you ever want to check your work, maybe you like one version better than the other, but it asks you to use a different version, you can always check it using the other versions. You'll get the same answer every time, and that's kind of nice. All right, well, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise,